Okay, so welcome to the fourth team-based learning presentation, and we're going to be starting the digestive system. And with this presentation, we're going to look at the oral cavity down to the esophagus and how food enters the stomach through the esophagus. Okay, so as I always like to do, I like to kind of quantify the system that we're talking about. Okay, and so the gastrointestinal tract will be what we will be spending some time with over the next week or so here. And the way to think about the GI tract or the gastrointestinal tract is that this is one long tube, and it is literally a continuous tube all the way from the esophagus to the anus, and very similar layers all the way through and membranes. And one thing to note is that if something is inside the GI tract, it's considered outside of the body. Okay, and so I said a long tube, and it is long. It's about 30 feet long in the average size human, so a very long tube. And then one of the amazing things about the GI tract is the amount of surface area found in the GI tract. Okay, and so especially in the small intestine, we have lots of these little things here called villi and microvilli, and we'll look at those a little bit more in depth, not this section, but the next section. All these different folds and outcroppings are places where blood vessels are found, and places where all these endocrine or enterocytes are there, the cells of the digestive tract that are there to digest and absorb nutrients. And so all of these little folds, if you count all the surface area on every little layer of these, and you put all that surface area into one area, we have about the size of a football field. So there's just a massive amount of surface area, and the key to remember with that is the more surface area we have, the more room we have for doing the business of the GI tract, which is absorption. Okay, and so the reason for the GI tract, why do we need the GI tract? Well, this is what provides nutrients for the structure of the body, the function of the body, energy creation, and all cellular processes of the body. This is where we get everything in. Okay, so the general processes of digestion are as follows. We have ingestion, mechanical digestion, and chemical digestion. Okay, so ingestion is literally just getting food into the body, and so this is obviously eating, or if we have other ways to get it in, like are shown there. And then we have, from there, after we eat it, ingest it, we mechanically digest it, and that happens throughout the GI tract, but it starts in the mouth. And the function of this is to kind of break up the food and prepare it for more enzymatic digestion, make it more available for the enzymes to interact with. So this happens by chewing, by the tongue, smashing and mixing food around, by churning food in the stomach, and by segmentation, which we'll talk about what that is in a sec. And then we have chemical digestion. So this is the breakdown of food particles into smaller food particles that help prepare it to be absorbed. Okay, we have to get most food particles to their smallest components before we can absorb it. And this is mostly done by enzymes. So these enzymes include lipases, which break up lipids, zymogens, which are called proteolytic enzymes. These zymogens are the inactive forms. So proteolytic means they break down proteins. And then all the amylases are there to digest sugars and saccharides, any of the carbohydrates. Okay, so you can see how each of those enzymes match up with one of the three macronutrients: lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Okay, and then three more processes of digestion. Number one, we've got propulsion. And then what propulsion means is just moving food through the digestive tract. And so there's two major forms of that. Number one is called deglutition, also known as swallowing. And this is just moving food from the mouth to the stomach. And then we have peristalsis, which is a very common thing in all through the digestive tract, starting with the esophagus. And this is smooth muscle contraction kind of happening in waves. And you can see that here in this left side of the image. And you can see the two different types of muscle. There's the circular muscle wrapping around it, kind of just straight around it. And then there's the longitudinal muscle that goes straight down. And peristalsis kind of has an alternating pattern of the longitudinal muscles and the circular smooth muscles to be continuously kind of in a wave-like pattern driving this food downwards.
And then this is showing segmentation, which I mentioned on the last one. And this one is really only using the circular muscle, not the longitudinal muscle. And as you can imagine, this food is being pushed down by peristalsis. It's going down, and then all of a sudden, one part of the circular muscle just pinches in right here and actually stops that food from moving down, and it causes it to kind of swirl around in there and causes it to interact more with each other, with the other parts of the food, with the walls of the intestine, and kind of churn it up and break down some of the food that way. And so that's the segmentation. And so then the next process here is absorption, and this is just moving food particles from the digestive tract either into the blood or into the lymphatic system. We'll talk more about that later. And then lastly, defecation. This is just getting the undigested and indigestible substances out of the GI tract. And so then with this slide, what I'd like you to do is just kind of examine this figure here, and then look at these 6 different processes of digestion we just talked about, and go ahead and decide which parts of the GI tract each of these happen. Which part does where does ingestion happen, mechanical digestion, propulsion, all these things, and just kind of see how much of that you can interpret.
Okay, so then we have the multiple layers of the GI tract, okay? And so we're going to look at each of those layers, and the first layer is called the mucosa, okay? And the mucosa is the innermost layer. And then within the mucosa, we have multiple layers. Okay, so the most inner layer of the mucosa, which is the most inner layer of the 3 major layers, it'll make sense when you look at the picture here in a sec, but the most inner layer is simple columnar epithelial tissue. Okay, you'll remember that, those column-shaped single layer cells, and most of the time this type of tissue has goblet cells, which are single cellular exocrine glands, right? They're secreting mucus, okay? So the functions of those are shown here: to dissolve digestive products, to activate them, and then also to protect the GI tract by secreting that mucus, protecting it from damaging chemicals coming into the body. Okay, and then also in this layer we have enteroendocrine cells, and these cells are scattered throughout, and what they do is they're kind of monitoring the type of contents that are going through the GI tract, and then based on the types of contents that are found, they release hormones that are going to be specifically driving some of the processes of digestion. So again, enteroendocrine, so part of the digestive tract, but endocrine cells, okay? And then the next layer, moving from the inside out, is the lamina propria. And this is loose areolar connective tissue with capillaries, and the function here is to help absorb nutrients and transport hormones because we have those capillaries. And then finally we have a very small, thin, muscular layer called the muscularis mucosae, and this is the function of this is to move food, to dislodge it when it gets stuck in this mucosal layer. Okay, next we have the submucosa, and the histology of this is it's dense irregular connective tissue. Okay, so this is next after the mucosa, moving out away from the inside part of the GI tract where the food will be going through. Okay, so this is many elastic fibers here, found here, and the function is to maintain shape of the GI tract after it gets stretched out when a big thing of food goes through there. Okay, we also find blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves in here. We have blood vessels because that's going to help with digestive products being brought to the rest of the body. Lymph vessels because that's going to bring how we bring lipids into the body, and nerves because this is how we control smooth muscle. And these nerves are part of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, and then we have the muscularis externa, which is the next layer out after the submucosa, and this is pretty much all smooth muscle. The most inner part is the circular fibers, the most outer part is longitudinal fibers, and then the stomach has an additional layer which is oblique, which is kind of a diagonally sectioned or diagonally angled fibers, and this is so we can squeeze down that food in all different directions and do different types of functions with it. Okay, the circular fibers will kind of cut off and segment the GI tract, whereas the longitudinal fibers are used to do peristalsis and push the food down linearly. Okay, and then we also find sphincters in this layer. So these are thickenings of smooth muscle, and the reason of that will be to completely close the GI tract in certain areas to prevent backflow, or also to slow down the movement of the food that's passing through. Okay, and then next external layer, the most external layer is the serosa, And this is all serous membrane. So just like the other ones around the heart and around the lungs, we also have a serous membrane around the GI tract. And so we find simple squamous epithelial tissue, and then also some connective tissue here. Okay. So again, we have a visceral and a parietal layer of this. Visceral is closer to the GI tract, whereas parietal is going to actually be lining the abdominal cavity on the out further away from the inside of the GI tract. Okay, so this is mainly to protect and cut down on friction. Okay, and then this is where we find the mesentery, that nasty stuff you guys pulled out of the cats. This is where we find that. This is this folded double layer of this peritoneal cavity, peritoneal lining. And the function of this is to hold the organs in place and also provide some stability for the nerves and blood vessels that are passing through this area.
Okay, and then this slide is just an image of all the different layers of the GI tract that we just talked about. And this is right from your book, figure 22.2. And I'd like you just to go to your book and fill in these different layers and try to trace them back to the 3 previous slides that we talked about all these on.
Okay, so the digestive tract has a special blood supply, and so 2 different kind of parts of it here. You have what's called the splanchnic circulation, which is really the blood supply to the GI tract, and this can take about a quarter of the cardiac output while it's doing its work. Okay, and this can even increase a little bit higher during periods of major digestion. Okay, and so the functions of this circulation are to feed the cells of the GI tract. Obviously, they need a lot of nutrients to do all the work of digestion, but also we need the circulation there to absorb the nutrients and to bring those back to the body. And then this is where the hepatic portal circulation is. And we've talked about portal circulation before when we talked about the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. But the deal with this is any portal circulation system, you have 2 capillary beds, right? We talked about that before, so that's not the normal setup. 2 different capillary beds. So this is really how we get blood flow to the liver. But the deal with this is you can see here, we have the first step is we have this capillary beds that are surrounding the GI tract and the small intestine, where most nutrients are absorbed. So nutrients flow from the small intestine into those capillary beds in the GI tract, and then they're going to travel towards the liver. Okay, so going from the small intestine, going towards the liver. Okay, and then they're going to go through a capillary bed where they can be filtered out of the blood into the liver, where the blood can be filtered and those nutrients can be taken out and dealt with by the liver, and then they go back into that capillary bed to be dumped back into the main circulation and back to the heart. Okay, so there's 2 separate capillary beds before it makes it back to the heart. That's a portal system. Okay, so then we also have a specialized nervous system in the GI tract called the enteric and nervous system. And this is unique because it's not controlled by the central nervous system. It's somewhat similar to the parasympathetic nervous system, but this is considered part of the autonomic nervous system. And the functions of this are really just to coordinate the activity of digestion of the GI tract, and so to make sure the pace of the movement of food is good, and so this is what's helping contract all those smooth muscles and move the food along. Okay, and you don't need to know the names. You don't need to know all the stuff on this figure over here. You just need to know this stuff written over here. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit at the cavities that the food goes through, starting from the mouth down through the esophagus. Okay, so the oral cavity, we've already looked at most of these structures already in the previous slides. We talked about the respiratory tract. So what you can do here is just look at these structures here and label where they would be found here. One thing to note, a couple things to note: this is obviously the hard palate. This is the soft palate. Okay, we have this big tongue here, and you can see there's extrinsic muscles of the tongue which originate on the bones of the skull and the jaw here, and then we have intrinsic muscles that are up here. They originate within the tongue. Okay, and the extrinsic muscles act to move the tongue, whereas the intrinsic muscles act to change the shape of the tongue. Okay, and so you should just be able to label these different structures here from figure 22.7. Okay, now we have some very important salivary glands. Okay, and the salivary glands are really glands with ducts that open up into the mouth. Okay, so these little glands that I have circled here, you don't need to know the different names of them. You just need to know they're here and they're dumping substances into the mouth. Okay, and within these glands, there's two different cell types. There's the Serosa cells, which produce a watery secretion that contains enzymes for breaking down food, and then the mucus cells, which contain or releases thick, stringy mucus that does not have enzymes. Okay, and so the secretions are pretty much going to be continuous. We're always releasing fluid from these salivary glands, and it's a pretty amazing amount. It's about 1 liter to 1.5 liters of fluid a day that's coming out of these. And so this is all going down the GI tract and out the body. So we can lose quite a bit of fluid through our salivary glands. And one thing that's important to understand here is that the difference between parasympathetic control and sympathetic control of these salivary glands. Okay, so parasympathetic activation leads to thin, watery secretions. So this directly stimulates the Serosa cells here. Okay, so facial nerve 7, or cranial nerve 7, which is facial nerve, and glossopharyngeal cranial nerve 9 stimulates the Serosa cells, and this is going to be to aid in digestion. So parasympathetic nervous system controls digestion, right? If we have sympathetic activation, we're going to stimulate those mucus cells instead and get this thick mucus-like secretion. And the function of that is to decrease fluid loss. If we're stressed out, then we want to hold on to fluid. That's the function of that. Okay, so then the teeth are part of the oral cavity, I'm not going to go through this too much, but I do want you to know the different layers here of the teeth and be able to layer that. So there's the different there's the tooth structure and the different levels: the crown, the neck, and the root.
Okay, then this figure is an image directly from your book, figure 22.6. What I'd like you to do is just go to the book and go ahead and label the different parts of the tooth that we just talked about on the previous slide.
Okay, so then now moving out of the oral cavity into the esophagus. So the esophagus is really what's connecting the laryngopharynx to the stomach. Okay, after we move past the pharynx, the lowest level of the pharynx, to the stomach. Okay, it can completely collapse when it's empty, which is kind of interesting. And we have this. It's a very muscular organ, just this muscular tube, and it has 3 different sections to it. Okay, so the upper 1/3, the part that's closest to the mouth, is all striated / voluntary muscle. We can control that. Okay, the middle 1/3 is about half striated, half smooth muscle, so we can kind of control it, but not completely. Part of it is involuntary. And then the lower 1/3 is all smooth muscle, meaning that contraction of that lower 1/3 of the esophagus is completely involuntary. That's what answers what does this mean. Okay, one clinical application here, as I mentioned before, the esophagus goes right through the diaphragm, as it's shown here. So you have the diaphragm coming here. In order to get down to the stomach, we've got to pass through the respiratory, through the thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity. Okay, so it's got to poke through the esophagus here. One of the problems with this is this hole is called the esophageal hiatus, and one of the problems with this is called hiatal hernia. Okay, and so with the hiatal hernia, the stomach actually pushes up through that hiatus, and then you get this opening up here, and some of the stomach is actually found in the thoracic cavity, and this leads to major GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, because the diaphragm was kind of helping out the sphincter that's there. And I'll show you where that sphincter is in a sec. That sphincter is called the gastroesophageal sphincter, or they're also called the cardiac sphincter. And you'll see there that's about where it's found. And so that's right where the diaphragm should go, and that by the diaphragm squeezing down, that helps that helps out the function of that sphincter and keeping food from going back up into the esophagus, which is reflux disease. And so with that different alignment, you get a lot more GERD. And this is that sphincter's job is to prevent backflow. Okay, so finishing up here, starting with actually digestion. Okay. The first part of a digestion starts in the mouth. Okay, so we get some mechanical digestion. Obviously, the chewing of food is very important because it breaks up the food, makes more of it available to interact with the enzymes. And then we also have some chemical digestion that happens here too. So we get parasympathetic nervous system activation of the salivary glands. So we stimulate those Serosa cells that secretes the thin watery secretion, which contains an enzyme called salivary amylase. Okay, if you go back to the beginning of these slides, you'll see that all the amylases are there to break down carbohydrates. So that's what salivary amylase does. We partially start breaking down carbohydrates. Okay, and this is important to know that this is where chemical digestion starts. And you can kind of do this by putting something like a piece of bread or a cracker or something that's a polysaccharide into your mouth and just let it sit there. After you chew it up a little bit, you'll notice it starts getting sweet. And that's because it goes from being a polysaccharide down to at least to a disaccharide, sometimes to a monosaccharide, not quite to a monosaccharide yet, but maybe down to disaccharide, which is sugar and can taste sweet.
Okay, and then the next few slides get into one of the main physiological processes that we'll talk about in this section, which is swallowing, also known as deglutition, and it has a voluntary phase, pharyngeal phase, and esophageal phase. And then the voluntary phase is mainly with the mouth and the very top part of the throat. This is getting the food into kind of a ball known as a bolus, and then moving the food into the throat, into the pharynx, and that's done by the tongue. And then the pharyngeal phase, we have a couple interesting things that happen. The nasopharynx is blocked off by the soft palate moving upwards, and then the trachea gets blocked off by two things happening: the larynx lifting up and the epiglottis tipping down, and both of those things together closes the hole to the respiratory tract known as the glottis. And then the pharyngeal muscles contract, which moves the bolus down towards the esophagus. But before it can get to the esophagus, we have to relax the upper esophageal sphincter, which opens that up, and that allows the bolus to move into the esophagus. And then the peristaltic contractions happen in waves and push this food down all the way towards the stomach, and then it reaches the gastroesophageal sphincter, which is right above the stomach. That relaxes and opens up, and then the food enters the stomach. And so we see these three processes here, and you can go to your book on figure 22.9, and it'll clearly explain what's happening under each step 1, 2, and 3 here. And these two other steps are not in your book, but these are just the parts where the food is down into the esophagus and gets down into the stomach, so you can kind of just examine that. And then lastly, what I'd like you to think about is just to be able to answer these different questions based on the two previous slides, and kind of recap the process of swallowing, deglutition, getting the food from the mouth to the stomach, just by seeing where is the bolus in each step, what action is moving the bolus, and what structure, what other actions are being taken to make sure the food doesn't go somewhere it's not supposed to, which muscles, structures, and sphincters are involved in each step, when is each sphincter opened and closed, and that should do it. And that'll wrap it up for this set of notes.